There are a few chess games that everyone must know, often shown to their students by grandmaster players, known as immortal games. Whether through genius positional ideas or crazy sacrifices, these games provide great entertainment and practical instructional value. Today I'll be showing one of these games called the Evergreen game. This game contains one of the most beautiful queen sacrifices I've ever seen in my life. Let's get into it. Anderson began with e4, typical 1800s play, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, classic play, defending the pawn with a piece, not with a pawn as you see in the Philidor defense, and then bishop to c4, putting some pressure on that pawn on f7. This is called the Italian game. Bishop to c5, copying white, doing exactly the same thing back to him, and then white finally breaks the symmetry, playing a move, pawn to b4, a clean sacrifice of a pawn. This is known as the Evans Gambit, and the idea is white sacrifices a pawn for initiative into the center and to get his piece into the game quickly. So for the cost of a pawn, white gains a huge center. So black decides to accept the sacrifice, bishop takes b4, white then plays c3, the idea of the Evans Gambit, and once the bishop moves back to a4, which is actually the best move in the position, then Anderson strikes into the center with d4. And you can see he has this big center, and this allows him to rotate his pieces a lot more easily than black into attacking the king. So we see e takes d4, and then just castles by Adolf Anderson. And the idea is that if black decides to take this pawn, he can just play queen to b3 and later take with the knight. You have to play something like queen e7, and then later you can take with the knight. And if you take with the bishop, he can take back with the queen, and he has nice pressure onto this pawn on g6. If you move your knight, you're getting hit with the pawn, and you really want to avoid sort of lines like this because you can also set it up with the bishop first, and it's not very good for white, this line. Anderson managed to avoid this, but he plays a pretty dubious move. He plays pawn to d3, which is not the best response. Actually, in fact, the best response would just be to let this pawn get captured. Play a move such as bishop to b6, getting your bishop out of the way of ideas like knights coming out or checks and things like this. So you can put pressure on white's center from a distance. But instead, black decides to push the pawn, and this is a bit of a strange move because pushing this pawn just wastes a valuable tempo as the pawn is lost regardless. So we see queen to b3, setting up a battery here. This is quite a good move because these two pieces put pressure on that weak f7 pawn, and then black is forced to defend but sort of compromises position by playing queen to f3 because of course your knight wants to be there. Maybe not in this position because you get hit with e5 played by white, kicking the queen off of that square, and then Dufresne decides to move his queen over to g6, putting a bit of pressure on the white king. Now white has to respond to this maybe later on in the game because obviously you can get moves like d6 and then get your bishop out, threatening checkmate and maybe forcing white to weaken his knight and the light squares around his king. Rook to e1. Anderson has no interest recapturing that pawn. In fact, he can't even do it yet, so he's not even preparing to do that. He's just preparing to get his rook on the same file as the king. It's a good idea because this pawn is probably not going to stay in here for very long as it is deeply encroached into black's territory. So then we see knight to e7 played. Obviously, you can't go to f6. Preparing to castle. This is a good move. Also, these knights are now communicating, so it's quite a strong structure for the knights, unless they're both undefended, but the pawns here make this a great arrangement. So we see bishop to a3, getting another piece into the game, putting a bit of pressure on that knight, but nothing too serious yet. And this is where black plays a very strange move, b5, which sort of looks like it's rare pawn for no reason, but in fact there is a little bit of an idea here. The idea is, if white decides to take with the bishop, which seems like a more natural move, then you just have rook to b8, boom. Now you are pinned, and a move like a6 will quickly win the bishop. Probably not win the queen because you're going to move the bishop away, but you're not going to move the bishop away, sorry. You just move the queen away, and then you're going to lose this bishop, which is quite unfortunate because this bishop is almost the whole idea of white's play. I mean, if you move a piece out on move 3, you're probably going to want it to be in the game. Because yeah, the whole idea is this pressure on f7, which white will lose. So kind of an interesting pawn sacrifice. Apparently, black had a much better resource here. Black could actually have played pawn to d5, and after you take en passant, the engine's idea here is you take with the c-pawn, and Stockfish is trying to argue that this position is good, but with this isolated pawn and double pawns, I don't think you can argue that black is this much better here, because white is very active, but the Indian seems to like this variation, and white decides to accept the sacrifice with his queen, because when rook b8 comes, of course, defended by the knight, he can just move the queen away and say that, well, you've just sacrificed the pawn for no reason, you're a bit of a bozo. Bishop back to b6. Bit of an unnecessary move. That bishop was in fact defended, but I guess it frees up this knight to have some more attacking duties in the center. Better here would have been to castle, get black's king out of danger, but we've seen knight d to b2, just getting another piece into the game, and bishop to b7, developing. Again, better for black just to castle here, because this attack is going to rage through quicker than you might expect. But of course, black opts to develop his pieces and try and counter-attack. Sort of typical style of this era, you know, they just wanted to sacrifice everything and win. They didn't really want to win a long, drawn-out defending endgame. So we see knight to e4, setting up sneaky threats, so maybe knight d6 or knight f6, maybe putting more pressure on this white king. And then when you have so many attacking pieces, it's okay to sacrifice one. The general rule of thumb is, if you have 2 more attacking pieces than your opponent has defending ones, then it's usually okay to sacrifice, but of course, you do want to calculate first. So we see queen to f5. Black seemingly moves the queen for no reason, putting a little bit of pressure on this knight, but it was already hitting it, so very strange move here. It just gives another move for white to continue his attack. So we see bishop takes d3. White finally opts to recapture that pawn, and now it's got a threat. So not only has he recaptured his material, the material is now equal, but now he has a threat of knight to f6 check, which actually, so the queen, if black plays a random move, white can now play knight to f6 check, threatening winning the queen through discovery. And of course you can't take a knight because you had recapture with the pawn, and now white is simply up a queen. So we didn't actually see that in the game. Anderson avoided that threat. I think he could have just, of course you can't castle because it's the same theme. Jean Dufresne decides to just move his queen out of the way, back to h5 of the board, where it still remains somewhat active, but of course it's undefended, which could come into play later in the game. So then we see knight to f6 check. Jean Dufresne finally explodes the position, but apparently this wasn't the best move. The better way to play according to the engine was to slow play with knight d3 and use white's big lead in development by black's nonsensical queen moves and his sacrifices to win. But Anderson decides to quickly play by sacrificing his knight to open up black's king. Now, the engine thinks white has a slight edge here, but it really preferred a move like knight d3, just hitting black's queen and slow playing it. So we see g takes f6, of course, recapturing the knight, and then after e takes f6, white has some great pressure on black's king. Now, the thing is, this knight is now pinned. If you castle, you're going to just lose the knight, so it's very tricky to find a move for black here. Rook g8. And now this rook is actually in the game, so now you've recaptured, but of course, development is key, you know. It doesn't really matter what pieces you have, it matters where you have them. Like, you could have 60 queens on the board, but if it's mate in one with 2 knights and a bishop, it's not going to matter. So that's why activity is king. So this rook might become a bit of a beast, and of course, this knight is actually no longer defended, so that's another key theme. So this knight is no longer defended, but obviously, black is kind of getting smashed here. So we see rook a to d1 by Adolf Anderson. And you think, what the hell is this madman doing? Doesn't choose to capture, because black can just recapture with the knight. And once you capture with the pawn, it's hard to see what you're actually arguing for here. Doesn't take with the bishop. Decides to hang his knight in one move. Black says, okay, it's a bit of a very strange move. I'll accept the sacrifice. That wasn't white's idea. White decides to then sacrifice the exchange, another sacrifice of a piece. So of course this rook can just be captured by the knight, but you actually can't take back. Because if you take back with the knight, it is forced checkmate in just 4 moves. I know you're thinking, what's the checkmate? I mean, I guess you've got something like bishop e7 and then get your rook in the game, but wait, black's got mate in 1 at all times. What's the problem here? The mate in 4 is so brilliant, I'm not even sure most of you are going to be able to see it right away. So we see this mate in 4 is incredibly hard to find. And if you don't find it, it's mate in 3 for black. So very exciting game here. Yeah, so if you don't find the mate, you can try and stop the checkmate according to your king. The engine thought the best move here was queen g4. You have queen takes f2, king h1, queen takes g2, queen takes g2. And then bishop takes g2 is actually checkmate for black. If you try and play another move like g3, trying to stifle this pressure, well, this bishop is actually quite strong and you get mated on h1 just like this. It just cuts off all the squares of the king, so you're getting checkmated either way. But instead, white decides to play one of the most brilliant moves I have ever seen in my life. In this position, Adolf Anderson played queen takes d7 check, sacrificing a full queen for a checkmate in 4 moves with his minor pieces. So the only move here for black is to take the queen, and then we have bishop to f5 check. This is double check from the bishop and the rook, so black cannot simply just recapture this bishop. And of course, the way the diagonal works, the king cannot just hide himself away on c8. He has to go back to e8, faces further harassment. King e8 is the only move, and then we see bishop to d7 check. Now, either forcing the king here or here. So if you decide to slide over to d8, it's checkmate in 1 with the pawn, because obviously the bishop cuts off both these squares, and the bishop covers this. So you can checkmate with the pawn like this, or you can use the bishop as well. So you get this beautiful 2-bishop checkmate. And what happened in the game is Yeon Dufresne decides to play king to f8, and you see that there's not many squares for the king here. The king is completely boxed in. And again, you have this same idea. You can't take with the pawn this time, you have to take with the bishop. And this is what happened in the game. Bishop takes e7, checkmate on the board, with white teetering on the edge of mate in 1. He finds the most genius queen sacrifice ever played, you can argue, to win the game in such beautiful fashion. I mean, when have you seen him do 2 minor pieces and the rook and the pawn just coordinating so beautifully in the black position? And it also goes to show that material doesn't matter, again, a sort of theme of this game. Because look, I mean, look at all the pieces black has. Bishop, bishop, 2 rooks. Black's up a rook and a queen, but it doesn't mean anything. He's just simply checkmating on the black rook with these pieces almost standing around, not doing much, because it doesn't matter. If you're the king, it's just too unsafe. There's going to be another video popping up on screen now that YouTube thinks you're going to really enjoy, so probably good to give that one a watch. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe for more similar content like this, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one.